Welcome back. Here's the last clinic of the day for Gateway X. Our next presenter has been an avid model railroader since getting his first train set at age 8. He has written about his hobby since the 1990s and eventually started his own model railroad publishing business in 2004. Since 2009, he has been the publisher of Model Railroad Hobbyist magazine and often shares his extensive hobby expertise through the magazine's articles as well as in books and videos. He also models the SP Siskiyou line in HO, and his layout continues to fuel his passion for the hobby. We welcome Mr. Joe Fugate.
Well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here and to talk to you about TOMA, the one module approach. So you can summarize that and call it building a home layout in bite-sized chunks. And we actually covered how to do a TOMA layout on Trainmasters TV. So that's a video channel that we have. I call it Netflix for model trains. But let's get into TOMA. So let's go to the next slide. So let's look at the agenda here. So the first item is, how did TOMA become a thing? A little bit of background as to where it came from. And then why TOMA? What's the big deal here? TOMA, the one module approach. That's what it stands for. Then we'll look at how TOMA works. And then we'll look at get a little bit outside the box. And I call it TOMA with a twist. And then we'll also look at what I call TOMA meets the 4x8, since that's a popular beginning layout format. How might TOMA work to create more options for beginners? And then I'll also look at an example, which is my own Siskiyou Line 2. I've dismantled my original Siskiyou Line, and I'm now starting to do a new layout, calling it the Siskiyou Line 2, and I'm using TOMA methods to do the Siskiyou Line. So let's get into it. Next slide. How did TOMA become a thing? So it actually didn't start out with the idea that it would become its own thing. I actually wrote an editorial, and the editorial was intended to remove excuses for armchair modelers to get started in the hobby. And so I called it the One Module Challenge. And the idea was, why do you need to be thinking about building this huge layout to fill a basement or to fill a big spare space that you have? Why not just build one module, 6 feet long, and build it at your workbench, build it in a workspace where you can be comfortable and do your best work? And I said, okay, and once and this is something you can complete in weeks or months instead of years, and you can do the full scope of the hobby on this one module, build it all the way to completion, hang some temporary staging off of each end, and run some trains on it. And you're on your way. You could then sort of continue to do that, and what do you know, you build enough modules, you got a nice home layout. So the idea was to use a kind of a modular sectional method to build a home layout. But that started to evolve, and eventually we started calling it TOMA, the one module approach. So next slide. So the first comment when I talk about TOMA is people say, well, what's the big deal? Isn't it just like marketing hype? Because we've been doing modules and sections for decades. And that's true. We have been doing modular or sectional design and construction for decades. It's not new, but it's mainly been, almost exclusively been, show layouts. There's not a lot that's been discussed, or even a lot of examples of modular or sectional methods being applied to serious home layouts. So modular methods aren't really that well understood if you're talking home layouts. And it does make a difference, because what you do for a show layout in terms of modular or sectional is different. And I'll go into some of that as we go through this. is different when you're looking at modular or sectional methods as applied to home layouts rather than show layouts. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here's an example of why modular or sectional methods might be different in a home layout. So one of the things that those who try a sectional approach often find is, they build it with the idea, I'm going to take it apart and move to a new location, put it back up in the new space. But what they often find is it doesn't work worth a darn in the new space because the layout doesn't fit in the new space. So one of the things TOMA does is it includes in the thinking that we need to design for this up front. Design for the fact that if you move, it's not going to fit in the new space. So TOMA includes the concept of what I call sacrificial modules. With when you design for TOMA, you design with the idea that certain modules will be very simple, but they're likely to end up in the trash if you move. And so you bake that in. So that's, you don't have to worry about that in a show layout that you're taking on the road. Okay, next slide. So this is classic TOMA as described in my editorial and what we started to call the one module approach. So the idea is you build a single modular section that's 4 to 8 feet long. I think 6 feet is ideal because you're talking about typically working on the module in a workspace. So you need to be able to take it into the layout room, take it into the workspace. So you need to be able to easily get it through a door. And 6 feet's about ideal. I think your typical door is like 6 feet 7 inches tall. So an 8-foot module will be a little tricky to get through a door. 4-foot module starts to create more joints. So 6 feet seems to be about the optimum. And it's interesting that in my original editorial, I just picked out of the air the 6-foot number. But as I've discussed it a lot, we've discussed TOMA design a lot on the Model Railroad Hobbyist Forum, we came up with the notion that 6 feet's about ideal because you want minimal joints, but still get through a door easily. So basically with classic TOMA, you build that module to completion. And then you hang flat top staging off of each end, and then you want more layout, build more modules. So next slide. So let's talk about what TOMA is not. It's not a layout you take on the road. The way I like to describe it is I like to say it's a movable layout, but it's not a portable layout. It's not like a show layout. Some people have said, well, I designed my layout, my home layout to come apart if I need to. That's not TOMA. TOMA actually gets taken apart during construction. That's the difference. You actually take it apart, take it out of the layout room, move it to a workspace. I call it the dirty space, and work on it there, and then move it back to the layout room. And the idea is that you move to a well-lit, very comfortable space where you can get around all sides of the module easily. And also the dirty space, you can, do scenery, you can get plaster all over the floor, all of that sort of stuff. Also, it's not just modular designed, repackaged. And as I mentioned, the home angle requires some new thinking that you don't have to worry about when you're talking about modular design for show layouts. So let's go to the next slide. I'll give you another example of how home design involves new thinking. So let's say we've got these kind of domino-like modules, right? Although they do have a backdrop on them, and they're just square and nice rectangles. So you can easily remove one of those modules forward or back. But in a show setting, typically you got lots of space around the layout to maneuver, so it's not going to be a big deal. But in a home layout, there could be a wall behind that backdrop. So you can't just move it any direction you want if you're going to take it out. Now you can easily move it forward or you can move it up or down, depending upon how much ceiling space you have. Usually in a show layout space, there's, the ceiling's 20, 30 feet above you. So there's not that constraint that you'll have in a home where you might have a 6 or 7 foot, I mean a 7 or 8 foot ceiling. So next slide. Let's make it even more interesting. Let's make the modules curved. Okay, now you can easily remove them forward, but you can't remove them backwards because they're pie-shaped. Now, it doesn't work. So you either have to move them forward or move them up or down. Again, what if we have a wall behind us? We might have some limitations. It could be there's actually the wall actually fills most of the space behind the backdrop. So you have that consideration. But let's make it even more interesting. Let's go to the next slide. All right, let's do an inside curve. And we've got a backdrop, we've got a wall behind us. See the problem? See, now you can't move it backwards because there's a wall back there. You can't move it forward because it's the wrong shape. So now you can only move it up or down. And what if you have a low ceiling? So see, these are the kind of things that make building a modular sectional layout in the home different than a modular or sectional layout that goes on the road to a show. Because the show space usually is very unconstrained. There's usually not a wall right in your way. So that's an example of the kind of thinking where TOMA says, we're going to focus on doing this in a home. And so what are the constraints in a home that are different than the constraints for a show layout? So next slide. So what makes it a TOMA? It is a home layout, not a show layout, that's doing modular sectional approach. And that A in TOMA, the one module approach, it's an overall approach. It's not a collection of any specific methods, and it doesn't require any specific modular standard. Next slide. But what makes it a TOMA is the layout is typically constructed in phases, one or more modules per phase. And then the idea is each phase is very quick. So it's something that you complete and you build it all the way to completion. I'm talking the scenery, the trees, the structures, the details, and we complete it in months, not years. And follow-on phases, phase 2 and beyond, can be vague. And it's still TOMA if the future is either open-ended or you know exactly what you're going to do. Next slide. Each section can be easily removed during construction as needed. That's why it's not the same as what I call a monolithic layout that could potentially be cut apart, but has never been cut apart. So it's not the same. And as I said here, it's the home layout, a home layout that could be cut into sections later. That's not TOMA. Okay. Next slide. Yeah. Okay. Now, typically with a TOMA approach, detailed pre-planning occurs only for a subsection of the layout. You don't plan the whole layout necessarily. Now you can, there's nothing to prevent you from doing that, but you can also just focus on one or a few of the modules you're going to start with, and then you can figure the rest of the layout out later. And I'll give you an example of that a little later on. You can add temporary staging to those earliest sections, and you can do operations right away. That's another distinctive of TOMAs. We want to get to finished and ops quickly. Next slide. Another thing that makes it TOMA is that generally the idea is you're going to build the module sections in a special workspace that's optimized for working on a module section. And you can do some interesting things here. You can actually put helpful accessories in your workspace. For example, what we're calling a module rotisserie. So you can actually build a set of legs and put the module on these set of legs, and then you can actually tilt the module to work on the underside. No more trying to imitate being a contortionist while you're crawling around into the layout and you're trying to solder the tortoises and the solder's falling in your face. None of that. It makes it very comfortable. And I find when I'm comfortable, I do my best work too. When I'm in a comfortable situation working on a layout, I want to get it over with as quick as I can, and I can get uh, make mistakes that I later come to regret. So now some optional thoughts too is with TOMA, you're building sections of a larger layout that's destined for a different space. That may be the case, doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but that's one of the advantages of TOMA. And optional, you deliberately use lightweight construction materials and methods. And the idea here is that if you're going to be working in a workspace and then haul it to the layout room and then maybe take it back to the workspace for another trip, you want it to be portable enough that it doesn't take 3 people to move it. And ideally, my goal is to have a modular section that's under 40 pounds. Yes. So also the module joints with TOMA, the idea is it doesn't look like a sectional or a modular layout. The joints get disguised so they don't show. And with TOMA, you have a lot of flexibility. You can either upsize, downsize, or replace or upgrade parts of your layout as needed without any major dismantling required. So next slide. Now let's talk about the cons. One of the problems could be that if you take a TOMA approach and you build a module and then build another module, then build another module, then build another module to eventually get a layout that fills your space, you might end up with a patchwork quilt. So that's where some advanced planning of the overall layout can help avoid that. But it could be very likely that that's what you could end up with. Also, very true, it's not as efficient as a monolithic layout that you build in phases. In other words, you build all the bench work, then you put all the road bed in, then you lay all the track, then you do all the wiring. You know, the advantage of monolithic like that is you can go, you know, buy several spools of wire and get a great deal on a bulk order of wiring, or bulk order of flex track, or, you know, buy all the lumber all at once and get a good deal, you know, all of that. But my counter to that is to ask this question: since when is the hobby supposed to be about efficiency first? And the example I give is, if it's really more efficient to buy everything all at once, then why don't we buy all our locos that way? That's more efficient. You could get a deal if you buy 20 locos instead of 1. But do we want to do it that way? No, we like the flexibility of buying 1 or 2 locos and then, you know, going to a swap meet or going to a train show and, oh, that loco looks cool, I think I'll get that. So we like the bit by bit approach. Plus, you don't have a big hit on the pocketbook all at once. Now, long term, yes, you probably spent more on locos than you would have if you were more efficient, but do you care? No, it's a hobby, right? So that's my comeback to that. Excess joints in the track, backdrop, wiring, and so on, that's very true. More joints than you would get in a monolithic style. It might not fit your personal building style. You just don't like the idea of building it in chunks. You want to, you know, do all the bench work, do all the road bed, track work, wiring, do it all like that. That's fine if that's what your preference. I'm not saying this is necessarily for everybody. But here's another one that's a little tongue in cheek, but there's actually quite a bit of truth in this. You might have so much fun that you're never motivated to build the entire layout. And but I mean, again, it's a hobby. So is that the worst thing in the world if that ever happened? And then finally, people will complain, hey, you're only building 1 or 2 modules and I'm running to stub end staging yards. The run's just too darn short. So, but I think, why TOMA? I think it's tailor-made for the 21st century. First of all, it fits our mobile society. It can go with you now. I've seen so many layout stories where it's the rip and replace story, right? It's like, okay, well, I had to move, so I had my dream layout that I was building, but I got a job transfer, and now I have to rip it all out. And so, 7 years of work kind of down the drain. I have to start over. It's not always all bad. You get to keep your learnings and start over, but still, it would be nice if there was some way to preserve at least some of what you did and not just have to rip it all out. Also, green is a big thing these days. And so I will say that TOMA is more green because it conserves resources. Unlike fill the layout room full of bench work and road bed and track and everything and rip it all out. So rip and replace isn't as green as building the sections and then having them go with you. TOMA also allows you to start small, but think big. You can think in terms of a big layout, but you don't have to start there. So it's much easier on your pocketbook and your time commitment to start small. And then as we go, we all learn. So why not course correct as you go? And TOMA lets you do that. Next slide. Also, more instant gratification. And that's a big deal, it seems, these days. But you get finished results in weeks or months, not years or decades. You can have if you think you have the dirty space, build 2 or 3 modules, take them, put them all together in the layout space. They look finished. It just looks nice, particularly dependent upon the concerns of your significant other. Having a layout space that looks nice might actually be a big advantage. Also, because you're building it as you go, you can find any thematic gotchas early on. So in other words, you don't fill the space with layout and do like I did in Siskiyou Line 1. When I got to the point where I was ready to install signals, realized that the bench work, I had bench work members right where signals needed to go. And I'm talking semaphore signals. So I had to put servos underneath that location, but there's bench work members in the way. And I'm not talking about just a joist. I'm talking about the L girder that held the whole bench work up was in the wrong place. So I would literally have to install a set of signals. I would literally have to tear an entire several foot section of wall of shelf out just to put signals in. And so if I'm building modules all the way to completion as I go, I'm going to find that signal problem on the first module or the second module. I'm going to find it early and I can then course correct. And you get to experience the full scope of the hobby quickly, all the way from design to operation and everything in between. Next slide. Plus, when you're starting small, even though you're dreaming big, thinking big, there's a much smaller resource demand up front, less time, less money. And so it makes the whole scope management much easier. And you can learn as you go as to what your work pace is. So you can, maybe you don't want to find this out, but reality, if you want to have a reality attack, you may find out, it's taken me longer than I thought to get all the way to a finished module. So I need to factor that in to your plans. So that's the kind of stuff that will help you as well. And as your skills and interests evolve, your layout can evolve too. So you can go, that first module I built, that looks like crap. I'm going to replace it because my skills are so much better now. Or you decide, partway in, you get really interested in narrow gauge. And so now you think, that first module I built, I could do dual gauge in the yard and I can have a narrow gauge branch go off this way. So it lets you evolve the layout more in line with your interests. Next slide. So here's how TOMA works. And let's just summarize the process so you kind of see how this works from end to end. So you start right at the beginning with your first module section, and then you do a track plan, typical, but you only really need to do 1 or 2 modules. Now you can design more track plan, and I recommend you at least figure out some of what the overall theme of the layout is, so you don't end up with a patchwork quilt. But you focus mainly on the first module or two. Then you build that first section in a workspace and you build it to completion. And then once it's complete, you move it to the layout space and you put temporary staging, hang temporary staging off the ends, and you run trains. And that gives you an opportunity to get into DCC, sound, programming decoders, speed matching. You start to do that side of the hobby as well. And now you go, it'd really be nice to have more layout, build another section. Basically, I call it rinse and repeat. You just keep doing it. Next slide. So let's talk about some design notes as you're designing with TOMA. So the sections can be any size or shape. And you notice I showed earlier some triangular shaped sections around corners. Plus, they don't have to be square. They can have, odd shapes. They don't have to conform to a standard, but they can follow a standard if you want. You're kind of free to do it either way. If you like the Fremo standard and you want to build your layout to a Fremo standard, hey, build it to Fremo standard. But with TOMA, each section can and often is unique. And so that means that the layout sections will often only go together one way. Next slide. So let's see. Okay. TOMA sections, they are part of a home layout, but they're not, as I mentioned, they're not intended for regular mobile transport. So that means there's no need to necessarily make them extremely mobile like modules. There are certain things that like the Fremo standards and different things will do because the modules are intended to be moved a lot to shows. You don't necessarily need to do that with TOMA home sections, because the average TOMA section will typically only have a handful of trips out of the layout room its entire life. And I've built a couple of TOMA sections now, and I built it in the workspace to the point where it had the road bed, took it to the layout space, put the legs on it, laid the track, cut the joints, wired it, then took it back to the workspace to put the scenery on. And then once the scenery was done, take it back out to the layout room and hook it up. So that's like a couple of trips, right? And I do intend to someday move, so I'm going to take the layout with me. So that'll be 3 trips out of the layout room, the total life of the module. So not a lot of trips. Next. The section joints typically get disguised, so they're not visible. And the idea is, even though it's built with TOMA sections, it should look like a permanent home layout. You shouldn't be able to tell immediately, oh, this is a sectional modular layout. And so that means you can take it apart with minimal damage. And then when you put it back together, you can easily repair the joints and it looks like one big layout again. Next slide. Plus there's nothing, next slide there, okay. Plus there's nothing that prevents the layout from using hybrid methods, a TOMA. So some parts can be sectional or modular, and other parts, like say the backdrop or the room lighting, can be room wide. So you might like paint the wall, cove the corners, paint the walls all blue, and hang lights from the ceiling, like can lights or whatever from the ceiling. And the modules don't have that part. They use the walls in the room and the lights in the room. So you can do that. Another one that I've seen is you can have support adjuncts such as tables or support rails. So Ken Patterson actually has done this with his layout. His layout is TOMA-like. What he did is he actually built a bunch of tables and lined them along the wall around the room. And then he built the sections, layout sections, using foam. And those foam sections just sit on the tabletop. So you can have support structures that are more monolithic structures that are not part of the TOMA sections themselves. So you can do that as well. So next slide. So you remember the classic TOMA. Let's look at TOMA with a twist. Let's try thinking outside the box a bit and see what other things we might be able to do with TOMA. So let's go to the next slide. So TOMA with a twist, scenario 1. You can add a temporary running distance between towns. You can have 2 modules. Each module has staging hanging off the end. And then you can add a temporary curve between the two. And that separation between the 2 modules, you can have a nice gentle curve radius between the 2 modules. So that gives you some running distance between towns. So next slide. So look at scenario 2. One of the complaints with TOMA is that people say, I really prefer continuous running. Okay, then let's do a continuous running version of TOMA. So we build a module, we do a couple of curve temporary pieces, and we put some staging, double-ended staging on it. Now we've got continuous running. And so that solves the run is too short issue, and you get your continuous running, and you have a nice double-ended staging, which is very handy. Okay, next one. Scenario 3. Well, how about we have 2 modules? So now we got 2 towns, continuous running. We got staging between at one end of the layout. We do sort of a curved double-ended staging. So you got more towns, nice curve radius, and continuous running. Next one. Or let's just say who needs staging, right? Just a couple of nice module sections, and we put some curve loops, turn back loops, whatever, between the 2 modules, and we've got continuous running, we got more towns, and you can see, you can just keep adding 3 modules, 4 modules, whatever you want to do. And if it works in your space, you can just put some temporary connections to give you your continuous running as you evolve the layout. Okay, next slide. So let's try looking at the 4x8. A lot of 4x8's a popular design for start out beginner's layout. And so what can we do in a 4x8 space with TOMA? So one thing you can do is you can do 2 by 4 foot 2 TOMA modules, and you can hang some of these temporary curves off the end. And so now you've got something that same footprint as the 4x8, but you've also got a couple of TOMA modules, which means later you can expand those into a nice shelf layout. And you don't just haul the 4x8 to the dump. You've actually got work that you've finished and you can reuse. So let's expand that a little more. Next slide. So 6-foot module is really a better configuration generally, I think, than 4 foot. So move to 6 foot. And so now you got 2 by 6 foot modules back to back with connections on the end for continuous running. And it's only 10 by 4 feet, slightly larger than 4x8. And you've got these superb 6-foot modules that you can use to expand into a nice shelf layout later. So next slide. So let's talk about an actual example. This is my Siskiyou Line 2 TOMA. Now you don't have to do it the way I'm doing it. You've seen so far the TOMA modules that we have been describing are what I call dominoes. So basically a box, right, with a flat on top or maybe some terrain on top and track running through it. No backdrop, no valance and lighting built in. But you can also do this. And so basically I love the shadow box style myself. And so I thought, I wonder if I could make TOMA modules that include an integral backdrop and include a valance with lighting, all as a unit. And so I came up with the typical dimensions would be it's 24 inches wide, 24 inches tall, and 6 feet deep. And the beauty of those dimensions is that that will fit through a door and I won't smash my fingers, because a typical door is like 30 inches wide. And like I said, it's like 6 foot 7 inches to the top of the door. So next slide. So I'm looking at using 1/2 inch pine plywood and using a torsion style bracing to make it nice and stiff. So that'll help it stay fairly lightweight. Using a 1x2 backbone where the backdrop gets put in place. And I do the 1x2 the flat way, so it's only 3/4 of an inch thick. And then I put 1/4 inch plywood plate on the 1x2 and 1/4 inch plywood plate for the valance and 1/4 inch plywood plate for the fascia. And then I laminate styrene on top of that to get a nice smooth surface. And I'm talking like 60,000 styrene. And I go to a plastic supplier and they sell that stuff in 4x8 sheets and they'll cut it to order. So I just tell them how the dimensions and they'll cut it for me. And I take it home and I just laminate it up. Very easy. And I assemble this using glue and wood screws. And then I have a note here about connection aids. Turns out Bruce Chubb of Sunset Valley, he actually used TOMA methods to build the Sunset Valley. I didn't realize that until I talked to him. He actually built the Sunset Valley as modular sections off-site. He built it in his father-in-law's garage, finished them completely, scenery, track work, wiring, everything. Then took it over to his basement and then set them up in his basement, connected them together. And his wife, Janet, loved the fact that there was no mess in the basement. He was doing the mess all over in her dad's garage. Okay. So, but one of the things he did is he actually put a plate, like a 3/4 inch plywood plate on the ends. There's kind of a profile panel where they joined. And then he would cut a groove in each plate. It's like 3/4 inch, like 1/2 inch deep and 3/4 inch wide. And then put those two plates together. Now you've got this square hole running all the way from the front to the back of the module. And then he would stick a keyed board, piece of wood in there that's the perfect shape to hold that. And it would allow the modules to line up perfectly. And the thing I love about that is the up and down is now locked. Okay. And the only thing you can do is you can slide it back and forth like this, right, to get the track to line up. But it's not going to deflect up and down because that indexed board in that slot holds it. So that's pretty brilliant. And I will be using that method. So it's things like that we can capture and bring forward that I think are where the TOMA discipline really will shine. Okay, next slide. Okay, one of the things I'm doing is I had a lot of problems with Sisculine 1. Looks like I messed up the title on this slide. But anyway, Sisculine 1, the fascia and skirting, the way that all attachment worked, I'd never planned for the skirting at all. And so I was basically stapling the skirting with staples, with a staple gun to the bottom of the fascia. And it just looked awful, and it was very ugly, and it would tear easily, and it just didn't work. So I'm planning with my version of Sisculine 2 to add this skirting arrangement. And we found this, visited a layout, and I saw this, and I thought, that's what I need to do. So basically, you put cup hooks in the fascia, or actually in the benchwork members, and then you take the little round white plastic pipe that's used to feed water to the ice maker on your fridge. You can get that in rolls. And then you get these little hooks that are used like for shower curtains and that sort of thing that have clips on them. And now you've got a perfect way to attach the skirting to your layout, and you can remove it, you can slide it back, just very, very nice. So I'm planning to accommodate that in each of my modules. Next slide. You can also, with the way I'm doing it, you can also put the lighting as integral to each module section. So I'm going to put a piece of triangular wood molding on the valance, and then I'm going to use LED strip lighting, and I'm using 3000K strip lighting. And the thing is, it's about, it's equivalent of 50-watt floodlight every 2 feet, which turns out to be pretty decent brightness, but it's only 6 watts. So it's very energy efficient and bright. And I built a couple of modules and used this method, and I'm very pleased with it. It works very well. So next slide. Let's look at another TOMA example briefly. Bill Beverly on the MRH forum decided he was going to build a TOMA type design as well. And so you can see, and he did this independently of me. We just sort of both came up with something that was similar. You can see how similar it is to my idea as well. So he came up with this and is basically building the shadow box style too. Next slide. So here's what it looks like when he's put them all together. And I can't tell the difference. That looks like a regular monolithic layout to me. See, so that's the idea, is once you put it all together, it's going to look like any other monolithic traditional layout. And this looks, this gives a really good example of what that looks like. Next slide. So my layout, Siskiyou Line 2, I've designed the main line route for the whole thing, but I'm only doing the detailed design on some modules down the center. And so I'm modeling Dillard and Roseburg on the SP Siskiyou Line, and we're going to drill in on the Dillard section here, because for my first TOMA project, go to the next slide. For my first TOMA project, I'm building a couple of modules from the Dillard design. Then I'm hanging some staging off of one end. And so, I'm going to build those 2 modules to completion, build the structures, some of the lumber mill. There's actually going to be some semaphore signals there on one end right next to the staging. And so the idea is this is going to take months instead of years to build, and build more module sections once these are done. I'll probably hang some staging off the other end as well. And then the layout room always has a finished layout. Next slide. So there's these 2 modules under construction, and then the staging hanging off of them. And so I built this as a prototype to test my construction concepts. And I pushed the envelope deliberately on trying some new construction methods here. And some things worked, some things didn't. So I'm taking the learnings from doing these 2 modules, and I'm going to build a version 2. And version 1 was on display at a couple of train shows, Kansas City and Salt Lake. So since it was modular, we could take it apart, stick it in the van, and take it to train show. That's not the intention necessarily for TOMA. It's mainly home layout, but it is possible to take it to shows. Okay, let's talk briefly about the learnings. Next slide. So one of the things I learned is that a 6-foot curve module is extremely awkward to try to maneuver with. Even though it's 6 feet, because the sucker's all curved, it acts like it's more than 6 feet, and it was extremely difficult to get it through the door. So for iteration 2, I've changed the design and moved the module joints around. And so I'm going to make sure that all curve modules going forward are 4 feet max. In this case, it's inside dimensions 41 inches for this iteration 2, revision 2. The 6-foot straight module's fine, but curved modules, So that's one of the many learnings that I made while doing this. And the idea with TOMA is there's a lot of things like this because, again, because you're not dealing with a show layout, you're dealing with a layout that's in a home. So you got a lot more restrictions in terms of maneuverability and manipulating the modules and so on that you just don't face when you're in a show setting. So that's the kind of stuff I want to document as we go through and continue to learn. And that's what will make TOMA unique, is that it will be specific insights just for home layouts. And so that's it. Any questions?
I'm sure there are questions.
Okay.
Let's just get to that screen. So, quick question: how would this be different than the domino thing that we've been discussing for ages?
Okay. I think domino could be a TOMA-like approach, but David Barrow, who invented the domino concept, even though he said the dominoes could be any shape, any configuration, any of the examples I've ever seen from him, it truly follows the picture you get in your mind when you say domino, which means the thing's a square box with a piece of plywood screwed to the top, right? It looks like a domino,
Mhm.
right? So TOMA, as you saw, for instance, the version I'm experimenting with is a shadow box style. So that looks different than what you think of with a domino. The domino style is more just the module with no backdrop and no valance.
Flat top.
But the domino also, I think the name's not real great because it conjures up the wrong picture. I think David Barrow intended that the dominoes don't have to be this square box with a flat top, but that's all I've ever seen, and that's all I've ever people typically do. So the one advantage with TOMA is a little more open-ended than just a strict domino approach. So that's the difference I would see.
So, someone asked, are there published standards for these modules?
No, it's called an approach, meaning it's not one set of standards. It can be a lot of different standards. You can use Fremo standards. You can use, NTRAC standards. You can use, you can use no standards. Do what you want. Every module's different shape. Each module goes together only one way. It's very open-ended in terms of the specific details. What makes it TOMA is you basically cut the scope way down, and you say, I'm going to build one, maybe 2 modules. I'm going to work them all the way, build them all the way to completion, hang some staging or something off the end so I can run trains, and then I'm going to go build another one, another module or 2. And you just keep building it to completion, building it to completion, building it to completion. So you always have finished layout. And that's the only real thing that is consistent, I think, between all the different TOMA approaches. And that's why I call it the approach, it's not called TOMS, right? The one module standard. There is no standard. It's open-ended.
So, there's no intention to shuffle these modules so that today you set them up this way and tomorrow the other way. That's
No,
not that's not the idea.
that's generally not the idea. You could, with Fremo, if you built TOMA modules to a Fremo standard, yes, you could connect them up differently. But that's generally not the intention, because the general intention is we're not talking show layouts with TOMA. We're talking home layouts. And generally speaking, most people with a home layout don't want to do, the shuffle modules around. You've got a particular design in mind. You're going to fill the space with this particular route.
Correct.
So that's generally how home layouts are done.
No, but nothing prevents you from packing them up and go showing them at a show, right?
Right. Although the problem is that with TOMA, you generally don't build TOMA modules to be as bulletproof as you would build a show layout. So they're not intended to be moved a lot. They're intended to, the thing I've used is it's movable but not portable. Okay, that's the term I've used to try to describe TOMA, because the idea is it's a very few times that you're going to move it. Now, the one TOMA that I did take to shows, and those modules are worse for wear now because they got beat up pretty bad going to shows.
Could you modify the Toma concept for a multi-level layout?
You could, you could. The thing I was thinking, if I wanted to do a multi-level, what I would do is I would do the shadow box design, because then you could take the next level and actually stack it on top of
Correct.
the other one. Now, all you simply have to do is figure out how to deal with the transition area, right,
Mm.
where you're going to have a helix or some way to get from one level to the next.
Someone mentioned that Toma and Dead Rail might work along because there's not necessarily a perfect need for track alignment on the ends unless you want signaling. Do you agree with that?
Well, I can see where Dead Rail and TOMA would work well together, because now you don't have to worry about running wiring between the modules.
Correct.
And so that could be very handy. Um, you don't have to worry about, um, frog wiring issues or any of that sort. So it certainly does simplify things. But what I found is if you're going to do a signaled layout, Dead Rail uh, complicates your life, because the best signaling systems are done with power on the rails and something like resistant wheel sets, because then the signal system works very much like the prototype, where even if there's one car somewhere in the block, it will trigger the signals. um, the other thing I've found is that with dead rail, it's one thing if you've got a dead rail layout where you've got 3 or 4 locomotives. But if you're like me, where I've got like 60 locomotives, and if I build a Siskiyou Line 2 Toma like I'm thinking I want to do, basically fill my basement full of modules, I'm going to have, 20, 30, 40 plus locomotives on the layout.
Hmm.
The thought of making sure every one of those locomotives is, all 30 locomotives are charged at the beginning of an operating session, that's a new headache. That, and so now, do I have to take all 30 locomotives off the layout and put them on a charger? Do I have to disassemble the locomotive to get access to the battery? Do I have to put a secret location where I can plug a power charger in? All of a sudden, I want, in my perfect world, I want to be able to trickle charge the
Yeah.
locomotive anywhere they are on the layout. I don't want to have to go move every locomotive to one location so I could charge it. Well, now I'm putting power on the rails again. So I want to have signaling, and I don't want to have headaches with having to recharge 30 locomotives at the beginning of an operating session. So the way it ends up for me is I'm going to need to power the rails anyhow.
Yes.
So it's there's some trade-offs. Now, if the day ever comes where we can do inductive charging, where I can have something in the ceiling that just transmits the power to the locomotives, then great, but we're not there yet.
So someone has been thinking he doesn't like any straight ends on the modules, so that when you assemble it, there's no the typical what you see the straight line from one module to another module. Any ideas of what would be the best to cover that up, or if not making them straight would be a good idea?
Well, it's going to complicate your life. Um, the thing is, if you don't want to see the joints, it's not that hard. A little bit of ballast, a little bit of static grass, a little bit of ground foam, and the joint's gone. The only place where you might have a problem is the backdrop. But if you're going to do a zigzag joint on a backdrop, uh, that it might look kind of goofy. What I'm planning to do is I'm going to, I'm putting a laminate of 1/4 inch plywood and styrene on the backdrop and paint the styrene blue. So I got a nice generic blue backdrop. And then as I hook several modules together, my plan is to actually do a photo backdrop. And so I intend to use some adhesive like what's used like for yellow stickies, that sort of thing on this, and do a panoramic backdrop, photo panoramic backdrop. And you can do, 30 feet panoramic backdrop, whatever. You can do some crazy things, and it's actually quite affordable.
Yeah.
And so then I'll just, do some sticky to put that up across all the joints. But if I ever need to take it apart, it will still come off. The photo, or the panoramic photo will still come off. So that's how I'm planning to disguise the joints on the backdrop.
Would Toma limit us to using grades and elevations on our layouts?
It's just like any other thing, you just plan for it. And what on my Siskiyou line 1, uh, I had, I started at one end. This is the lower deck. I started at one end, and the deck climbs around the room. So it runs all the way down the length of the room, climbs, comes back up the wall, climbing all the way until it finally gets to where it can go into a helix, a 2-turn helix to get to the upper deck. Okay. Well, since it's climbing the whole way, what I did is I would build the benchwork to a certain level, and the track's climbing, so the risers get taller and taller as the track climbs. And then I'd get to a certain point and I'd just make the benchwork higher. See? So what you do when you get to a module joint, you just make the module higher, that next one. Make the end plate that connects to the first module longer on the bottom, and put the top of that end plate higher, and then all the rest of your cross members can be shorter, not as tall. So basically you've done a stepped joint on your module so that you can now continue upgrade. And I just kept doing that all the way around the room. So many feet, and then I'd build the benchwork base higher, and so many feet, build the benchwork base higher. So that's how I would do a TOMA layout with a grade. Just keep making the legs longer.
Is the fascia in the front also module by module, or can you apply that last and have a continuous 8-foot section of green or black?
Well, what I would do is, the one thing I'm going to have is I'm going to have a joint every 6 feet, give or take.
Okay.
And a joint, the fascia is deliberately painted a dark color. I'm using a dark, kind of dark olive
Mm-hmm.
color. And the joint itself is not that easy to see when the colors are dark like that.
Correct.
And so I would just, design the fascia and I did this on my Siskiyou line 1 traditional layout as well. The fascia would get to a point, and then when the benchwork jumped up, then I'd do kind of a triangular transition in the fascia panel so that the bottom of the fascia moved up slowly as well. And I just do that on the modules too. And since the modules are intended to only connect one way, then it's going to connect. And just like the regular traditional layout, that section of fascia is just going to, be triangular, and kind of the bottom's going to slowly move up as you go. So it's not that hard, I think. And if you build a regular layout, you end up doing some of that stuff anyway.
Correct. So the same for throttle holders and car card boxes. you would apply those
Yes.
similarly like you do on your regular layout.
Yes, I have, let's see. I don't know if we can go back a couple of slides. You want to go back a couple of slides. If you look really, really close, just there's a middle leg there. Just to the left of the middle leg is actually a plug-in panel for a throttle.
This one right here.
Yes, and so that's, I put that panel there, and there'd be no problem putting a throttle holder there as well. And since it's got 1/4-inch plywood behind it, you can screw right into it, screw right through the styrene, right into the 1/4-inch plywood, and you can attach whatever you want to attach. Card boxes, cup holders, throttle holders, whatever you want. It works fine, and it's just like a regular layout.
So do you put the wiring underneath in at the time you build the module, and then you connect them to each other with connectors or terminal blocks?
Yes, I do. I make the wiring a little longer so that it kind of if the module's 6 feet, the wiring is going to be like 7 feet, right? So it hangs off the ends a little bit. And then the name escapes me, but there's some very commonly used, you can get them like from NCE. They sell them in a wiring kit. They're the block connectors, the wiring block connectors that the Fremo guys use. And I can't remember the name right at the moment, but we can borrow. What's that?
Anderson power pole?
Yes, that's it. I use those. And, there are standards like that we can borrow from the module show layout guys. And so that's what I use to connect all the wiring together. And I use red and black. It matches the red and black colors in the decoders. And so now my wiring feeds are red and black. And the way it works is red to the right. So, it's basically what the engineer's side is where the red goes.
Something like this.
Yeah. Yes. And I use red and black wires to match the connectors too. So the actual insulation color matches as well. And then do feed drops. Actually, a few issues back in Model Railroad Hobbyist, I actually covered my new wiring standards. And let me see if I can look it up for you real quick here. So we have a table of contents search tool on our site, so you can just type anything in. So I'll just type in wiring and search. See if I can find, my Siskiyou Line 2 wiring tricks, October 2019. So if you get the October 2019 issue, that'll have what you need.
You should have the key code. Well, Joe, I think we're already in overtime. So thank you very, very much for a really, really good clinic, beautiful slides, and an awesome idea for those who are starting to build a new layout and not sure how to do the whole thing at once. This would be an easy way to maybe just do 6 feet in the first 3 months, and then do the next 6 feet right after that.
Right. Yes. And I'm just having a ball doing Siskiyou Line 2 with TOMA. It's like I've rediscovered the hobby all over again. I'm having so much fun. So yeah, I really like it. So I recommend it a lot. There's a lot going for it, I think.
So thank you for your time, and thank you for the clinic.
Okay, you're welcome. Thanks for asking me.
Brad, any news?
No, thanks, Speed. Thanks, Joe, for a great clinic. What a great way to round out day 4 for the convention. I look forward to day 5 and what it brings and the rest of the week. So I'm going to go grab some sleep, and we'll catch everyone tomorrow. Thanks. See you.
Be safe.
Okay. See you guys.